Vernomatic Productions.
Are you ready?
Live from the Metal Mayhem Studios in Rochester, New York.
We are gold.
And heard around the world by metalheads just like you. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Heavy metal music.
Your weekly dose of metal music, interviews, album reviews, news, and more. Want to be part of the show? Send us a message through our website, metalmayhemroc.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Search Metal Mayhem ROC. A proud member of the Pantheon podcast team.
It's getting nice and heavy.
Now, welcome our hosts, John the Vernomatic Verno, direct from New Jersey, Metal Walt, and from the band Motorlord, Ian O'Rourke.
Good evening, everybody. As always, new content drops Thursday nights. We hope Rocktober finds everyone safe and healthy. On this week's show, we get the whole gang back together to resume our ongoing series, The History of Metal. This year, it's 1994. Metal Walt, Ian O'Rourke from the band Motorlord, and Bill the Rager from Order of the Dead tackle this year. I'm actually taking this episode off. But you know what? These guys will navigate you all the way through it as grunge is in full swing, new metal is gaining momentum, industrial metal's making an entrance, and our bands from the 80s, they're still releasing material, but they're definitely on the back burner. It's a real smorgasbord of content, many different facets of metal. They're fighting for, supremacy in this ever-growing metal landscape. The guys totally dissect where they were at this point of their lives, what they were into, what shows they were going to, where they were seeing them. It's hard to believe it was 30 years ago, but you know what? It really did happen. But before we get into this, if you're new to the show by either following us through Pantheon Music Podcast platform or our YouTube, join our community by getting up to metalmayhemroc.com. Join our email list. There you get alerts for brand new podcast shows, new exclusive YouTube interviews, alerts for my radio show on Monday night on Metal Devastation Radio, CD reviews, concert reviews. It's all up there, metalmayhemroc.com. Get into the archive drop-down box, recent audio podcasts. Last week we had Rick Emmett of Triumph, Tommy Victor of Prong, Udo Dirkschneider. They all have new material out. The YouTube channel, we had an interview with Wendy Dio, Sean Dover of Withering Scorn, Raven, Jag Panzer, Heaven's Edge. It's all up there. There's tons of content. So do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast, leave a review. If you do leave a review, we'll read it on the air. So listen, we appreciate you listening, viewing, all that good stuff. Now, let my cohorts of metal get you into the year 1994, the history of metal. I'm the Vernomatic. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Metal Mayhem ROC. Tonight we have a good episode. The band has come out of hiatus and retirement. The keys have been lost to that secret room in the basement for a long time. I went down there, I opened the door, and who came out? Bill the Rager and Ian O'Rourke. Guys, welcome back to Metal Mayhem ROC. It's been a while.
Right on.
What's going on, brother? We're glad to be back. It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. As we said last time, it feels like it took 10 years from 1992 to 1993, and I think it's been 18 years to get to 1994. But here we are. Listen, we are going to pull apart 1994 all the way through, from the good, the bad, the different, the ugly, whatever it is in between. But Bill, what was, just as on a personal note, what was going on with you in 1994?
94, I was living in Tampa, Florida, and I was fully immersed in the music scene down there. I was in a band called Swollen and was jamming with Richard Burnell, the old ex-guitar player from Morbid Angel. And, so I had my finger on the pulse of music at the time, and things were strange, I have to say. Extreme metal was going strong, but mainstream metal was kind of in a weird place at the time, I would say.
Well, absolutely. And we're going to go deep into all the albums that came out in this year and the different trends. And you're right. It was a kind of a fragmented year. And I look at it as Whereas 1987 or 88 was kind of the pinnacle for our 80s heroes. I think 1994 was the pinnacle for like the grunge era. You start looking at the top of the mountain and the albums that came out this year, and I don't think it got any better than this. And then you started seeing a trend into some new forms of metal coming through. But we'll get into all that. But Ian, what was 1994 all about for you?
So 94, singing and playing guitar in a band called DNR. We were completely against the grain of everything else that was going on. So a lot of the bands that were around, we were into, but we were still digging a lot of stuff from the old days, and we were just trying to bring it into the new era. And I can remember it being tough going, but there was still enough rockers out there that when we would show up and play gigs, that you would get the people that would all of a sudden migrate from the bar area and come stand up close to the stage, because they're like, oh, I'm not watching some kid in his, cardigan, and some ripped out jeans staring at the floor, trying to pretend that he's Kurt Cobain. So that was pretty much my experience with that. But musically, like Bill was saying, I mean, there was so much wavering, so much up and down. There was some stuff that came out and it was, man, who would have thought that they would have done that? But then there's other stuff that came out and you're like, it's kind of a mediocre pass at what everybody else has just done. So it's going to be an interesting conversation for sure. What about you?
1994 for me, I mean, I'm not a musician, but again, I was hanging on. There was a lot of concerts I went to. I was big into the Fight tour. The War of Words, they were still circling the States in 94. We talked about that last episode. Got on a lot of shows on that. Anthrax was around with Johnny Bush at that time. Rush kicked off their Counterparts tour. I was down in opening night in Pensacola, Florida, early in 1994. And then the one and only time I saw Pink Floyd as Pink Floyd on the Division Bell tour. So a little bit non-metal, but, it was up in the nosebleed seats of Giant Stadium. But again, Overkill was always through the area in Jersey. Always great metal shows. A couple of the bands we're going to talk about tonight, I saw some good gigs on. But sure. All right, well, let's get into it. Ian, start us off. Pick an album, a band. What do we want to talk here?
All right. I think that if I had to come to some kind of place where we all would have some kind of maybe connection to it, I can't not start off with not talking about Far Beyond Driven by Pantera. Okay, because that album, when it came out, was so abrasive and so heavy, but had such a good groove that it just really it took from where Vulgar Display of Power went and just kind of upped it by 10. It was just a fantastic album. All of the music, all of the, the vocals by Phil, all of a sudden he just completely got guttural. Everything just became aggressive and dark. And it was just very, look at the, some of the songs that are on there, Becoming, Good Friends and a Bottle of Pills. Listen to the words on that song sometimes. That you want to talk about a song to make you want to kill yourself. That's one. Shedding Skin, fantastic. And then just for shits and giggles, they decide to throw that curveball in there for all of the fans and end the album with a cover of Planet Caravan by Sabbath. And I remember thinking to myself, when you're reading the liner notes, when they discussed it, I was like, that's perfect. That's the perfect way to end that album, is to do that. Because you just went through that entire roller coaster ride of that album, which is more like, racing down the freeway at 100 miles an hour with no brakes. And then you get to the end of the album. It's like, there we go. Let's push play again.
Yep.
So.
Now, Bill, you're into the heavier side of metal, of course. Was this one that you gravitated to back then?
Yeah, it was. I was fully into Pantera at the time, and when that album came out, it was definitely brutal right from the get go. And I saw them on that tour twice, I want to say, and they played Tampa twice, and man, they crushed it.
Yeah, they did.
It was a very good show. Yep. And I met Dimebag and Phil that first night, the first time they played there.
What was that exchange like?
Yeah.
It was just a big giant party
huge.
backstage. You know, there a lot of drinking, a lot of hooting and hollering, and people going nuts. you could tell they were loving life at the time.
Was Crowbar one of the supporters on that tour?
No, on that tour, geez, I saw him so many times. I want to say, oh my gosh, it wasn't Crowbar though. In fact, oh man, I'm blanking on who it was, but I know it wasn't Crowbar.
Okay,
I
know that on the prior tour that they had done some shows, and then early on, I guess on the Far Beyond Driven tour, they did shows, and then eventually they hooked up with. I think they hooked up with Manson at one point. There was Typo Negative.
That's who I saw him with. Typo.
Yeah.
Yep.
Skid Row as well. It was, I don't know if that was on this album or previous albums. I was actually at a little fun party this past weekend. Mario Barth had a big tattoo convention up in Jersey called Inked Out, and they had a little 80s metal gig at the end of the night, and they brought in Stephen Pearcy, Sebastian Bach, Tammy Down, and Phil Lewis, and they played with the house band with some of the Canadian guys from Slash and the Conspirators, Todd Kearns and Brett Fitz. So anyway, Bach is up there, and he was reminding people that on these early tours, they were Pantera was the opening act for Skid Row, and they hit, I think it was the Slave to the Grind tour. So, but yeah, Pantera definitely grew to this period right now where, again, I think this is where now they were the new face of metal. This was probably their, climbing the mountain, their peak, and they would only get bigger from here. Some of the other heavier bands, like I was looking at the back catalog, Testament, Overkill, Slayer, all put albums this year. Now, Overkill for me, being a local guy, a big fan of this, and WFO, I mean, it seems like Overkill put out an album every year in the 90s, but Wide Fucking Open was a killer album, and just simply for the tracks Where It Hurts, Supersonic Hate, Under One, and then they had Bastard Nation and Gasoline Dream. These are just 5 fucking amazing Overkill metal songs, hands down. I love that album. The other Slayer, Divine Intervention, I'm not the biggest Slayer fan, but I don't remember that one. What about you guys?
Divine Intervention to me, it was just I'm not a big fan of that album. I did see him on that tour with Machine Head. I should have revisited it before this talk, but I don't remember liking that album too much. It seemed a bit too jammy.
Yes. No, really. You're not far off. Yeah, because I can remember thinking this is a total departure. I almost thought that they were starting to go the Korn route, with some of the vibe of what was going on. Testament, though, Low, great album.
Sick album, very heavy, very, very low.
So dark and heavy. Yeah, it was just oof. And then Overkill. I mean, Overkill was great. But yeah, this was that period with Slayer, like Bill alluded to. I mean, they kind of got weird for a bit. This was one of those albums that just was not your run of the mill Slayer. I mean, I always go on record saying, I mean, South of Heaven and Seasons in the Abyss to me are, I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the early stuff, but those 2 albums to me are like, now this is great material. This is great songwriting. When they hit this period right here, I was kind of like, I don't really care for it, and I just I wasn't digging the vibe, but, personal opinion.
Yeah, no, same here. And the majority of my friends felt the same way too, that we're big into Slayer. At the time, we just felt that record it was like they were just going through the motions.
Yeah.
And they were trying something new, but it wasn't quite fitting right for them.
Of course.
Yeah. I just don't remember liking that album too much.
Now, talking about bands that in that same kind of explanation that sort of went in a different direction and we weren't sure if we liked it, but we did, but we didn't. How about Queensryche, The Promised Land? Now, this one for me, it was definitely a departure. I mean, they came off Mindcrime and Empire, and, you're just expecting that they're going to make a 10 out of 10 album every time. Promised Land comes in, and it's very different, right? I mean, you had the heavier tracks such as Damage and IMI, but then you come into stuff like Disconnected, Lady Jane. And I think this was the time where there was starting to become a little bit of divide between Tate and DeGarmo. Tate's going one way. He's doing what he wants. DeGarmo's sort of backing off. They were still a big band, but in a sense, they are already on their way down from their peak. So what did you guys dig about this album or not about this album?
Just like you said, it had some great tunes on it, but the majority of it was very dull. Jeff Tate was the big influence on. They're trying to write another hit, and it just didn't quite take. But I will say I saw that tour, and man, that tour was phenomenal. They had a great stage show. They had it was like they were acting out a play, and there was different acts, and they had different stage setups. I mean, it was amazing. I don't know if you guys saw that tour.
No, I remember hearing about it, Bill, but I didn't get a chance to experience it.
Yeah, I saw that, and Typo Negative opened up that tour, and that was when Typo was in. They were the band that didn't fit in anywhere anyway, so they would just get shoved on all these tours. But it was a big package, Bill, playing the amphitheaters, right?
I saw them in it was indoors in Tampa. It was summertime, so it was indoors, but it was I think it might have been the Florida State Fairgrounds, actually. Speaking
of Tampa, since you bring it up, our boys from Sabotage, right? They released the first album without Chris Oliva, and it's Handful of Rain. Now, Ian, you and I are big Sabotage junkies. Yeah. We like all the eras, but I love this album. It was also a rebirth of the band for me. It was kind of odd seeing Alex Skolnick up there playing guitar live, but, it didn't make sense at the time. We couldn't understand how they could continue without Chris, but you had Zach up there. It was a second album and tour, and you had John over there in the corner playing keyboards in the wings. It was different, but it was good. What'd you think of that one?
I loved it, it was kind of that Band-Aid, I think, that a bunch of Sabotage fans felt. There's a lot of guys, I know that Bill, harkens back to the, the Sirens and the early stuff that's, really just, and I think, you had experience with them when you were in Tampa, right? Didn't you have I actually met John Oliva at Morris Sound Studios right around, it had to be when they were recording this album, actually. Yeah. And I had a tough time with this album, though, because I'm old school. I like the first three albums. Power of the Night to me is just amazing. And, and so, I don't dislike it. It was such a change that I had a hard time getting into it. Sure. But this album actually got a lot of radio play in Tampa. I don't know about elsewhere, but they played, what song was it? Handful of Rain?
Handful of Rain.
Probably Handful of Rain. Yep.
See, I can remember when this came out, the first thing that caught me off right off the bat was Taunted Cobras opening track. And you're figuring, okay, they clearly had Skolnick involved with some of the writing aspect of it. But unbeknownst to a lot of people, John Oliva, sat there all the time with Chris, nailing stuff out. Chris was the virtuoso, but John is no slouch. John can play guitar very well, and John is a monster on the piano, as we all know, and, his voice, I still love his voice as one of my favorites of all time, especially when you hear him. He just had a distinct voice, and it was powerful. And, the one thing I will say with this is you can see how post Hall of the Mountain King, by the time they got to this point, after Gutter Ballet, you get in the streets, you can see that build, the theatrical build, the more that kind of dynamic build, very orchestral, very, it's still heavy, it's still metallic, but it's taking on a different creation. And you can see where it's a very easy step from this album to the next album to now all of a sudden everybody's favorite Christmas show, Trans-Siberian Orchestra. You can see it with that progression.
Well, just picking out the song Chance, to me, this is the best song on the album. but that one stood out. Everybody, it's track 3 on the album. You get Taunting Cobras, which is your traditional metal track. You say, all right, it's okay, I get it. And then you have the title track, which was good. And then Chance comes on. When you hear it for the first time, you're like, what? Wait, what is this? Right? And just a great track. Probably one of the best Sabotage tracks. I think top 10 songs in their whole catalog across the album, in my opinion.
It's a good I said, the thing was it with the vocal dynamics and Zach doing that a cappella, singing where he's harmonizing with himself. So all of a sudden he comes in on this line and then he comes in over on this side with this line, comes in here. But the whole thing is building and then it gets to that big chance, that big chorus. It's like, wow, holy cow, who would have thought that would have occurred? Yep. But in this time, Bill alluded to this in, our pre-production, it was such a weird time, but there was, with the crap, there were moments of brilliance. And this album, for me, at least personally, had some moments of brilliance on it that really kind of jumped right out at you.
Bill, you alluded in the beginning of the show, you had kind of mixed feelings of this year as a whole. Like, what were some of your things you really disliked, or maybe what were some of your favorites, the kind of shining stars in this year?
I mean, the things I disliked, I honestly, like when grunge first came around, I didn't mind it because it was a change. It was different. It was, it was a breath of fresh air at the time because hair metal was getting kind of played out, I guess. And, but then at the same time, by 1994, I was worn out. It was this seemed like things were starting to get regurgitated. And it was probably the peak time of it, but it was also, it was not cool to like Judas Priest. It wasn't cool to like Iron Maiden. Guitar solos were almost non-existent, you know?
Right.
And so 94 was a kind of a tough year for me. And, in that sense, I can't really say there's anything I truly hate. But like by that time, to me, Soundgarden, I didn't really care for that album so much. And, I liked their earlier stuff. I thought they were different when they first came around and just, and I know this album was definitely their peak as far as commercial and accessibility and whatnot. But I guess I just wasn't as much of a fan of it. In fact, Spoon Man, I got to say this. Why you can't hear the damn spoons? Why? Turn the spoon.
A little bit, just a little bit. You can hear it. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. This was the FM album, though. This was what was played on hard rock radio. Like in New York, we had K-Rock, 92.3 K-Rock, and 6-7 songs off of this album. I mean, yes, they were a little bit more radio friendly. And to a degree, I agree with you, Bill. This was a slow change of them into the more mainstream. But for a guy like me, I love this album. I mean, this to me is just great top to bottom. I love this one.
Well, I think 87, 88 was that pinnacle. This was one of those albums that was that, okay, this is it. This is nothing you're going to do is going to go beyond this, and I think you could see that this was those flickering flames of that comet coming across the sky that was Soundgarden. Just like, Alice in Chains for better portion, they released Jar of Flies, but, other than being the radio friendly little EP that it is, there was nothing stand out versus the Dirt album, which came before it. And by the time you get to the next album, it's almost like it was, okay, we're going to take the last remnants of leftovers that we had while Lane was still cognate and we were together as a band, and we're going to throw that out there. But, there's radio friendly stuff on there, but for the most part, it's all kind of just, It's
different. Yeah. It is. It's radio stuff. I mean, you could have billed it as the EP was a little bit more acoustic-y and maybe a little more unplugged, which was the trend at the time. I personally think this album is pretty good, but it is different than their traditional, normal albums. But it was funny. I was driving in the car early this morning and Nutshell came on Sirius XM, and I was like, my God, that's such a good song. There's a lot of what I loved about this era of Alice in Chains or this album was like it was uber melodic.
Sure.
I mean, how do you not appreciate everything that goes into the song? No Excuses. I mean, you can't not like it. It's got the little drum parts and the harmonies. Sure. It's a good one, sure. But it was a departure. But it kept them. This is what I mean about that pinnacle time of 94. You had Soundgarden, you had Alice in Chains, and we have others that we can talk about too. They were all humongous at this point in time in their careers, right?
Yeah. And I like Nutshell and I Stay Away. I think those are great songs. I mean, they're just phenomenal. At the time, if you remember, they did play the hell out of them on the radio, so people might have got sick of them quickly, but those really are good tunes. But you're right. Compared to Dirt to me is their high watermark.
Yeah.
Right. But then you look at other albums that came out this year, since we're in this category, right? You had Stone Temple Pilots that released Purple, right? And Purple, again, you couldn't turn on the radio and not hear any one of Soundgarden or Alice in Chains, right, or Stone Temple Pilots, or another band that we're going to talk about after this. But again, Vaseline, Interstate Love Song, right. I mean, Big Empty, Unglued, right. Still on the radio to this day.
I will say, for me personally, I would take this album over Super Unknown or Jar of Flies.
Wow. Yeah,
because
that's a bold statement.
Because what I liked about Stone Temple Pilots, is as dark and ominous as the Seattle bands, the Soundgardens, the Melvins, Alice in Chains, those kinds of bands were. Stone Temple Pilots was an LA band. So they adopted a lot of the dark tendencies that was coming down the pipe, but they still kept a heavy rock vibe. And Weiland is such an enigma. He's like David Bowie or Axl Rose. You never know what one you're going to get. It's just fucking insanity every time. But the performance that they put on is just fantastic. And when you listen to the songs for that album right there, I would take Interstate Love Song over anything on Jar of Flies. I think Interstate Love Song is probably one of the most well-crafted songs that has ever been created. And when you listen to it with the vocal harmonies and the way that the band plays together and all the parts and stuff like that, and it's melodic. Yeah, it's kind of laid back. Yeah, it is. But it's a well-written song. So if you're talking about, I'm not really into good songs. Okay, well, then don't listen to crap songs. But if it's like, I really like a good song, that's a really good song. You go back and you listen to it and you're kind of sitting there and it's like, man. And it's one of those songs that really puts you in a nostalgic trip when you hear it. Like you won't hear it for, months on end, maybe a year, whatever it goes. All of a sudden it pops up on the radio and you're like, I remember this. This is some cool shit. Makes you smile. You're singing along with it. So that's what I love about it.
And I tend to agree with you. And I mean, I would go the route of STP, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden any day over a couple of these other bands. And I'm not being critical, but I'm just not a fan of them. So, Bill, three bands here. Pearl Jam put out Vitalogy, another gazillion albums sold. You had 9 Inch Nails, who released The Downward Spiral. And then you had Nirvana's Unplugged New York City MTV show. Again, he was gone already. I mean, This album wasn't supposed to come out. He was already gone, committed suicide a year earlier. But these were the other bands that were all over radio. And to me, 9 Inch Nails, this was the start of that industrial sound. I personally wasn't a fan. Didn't like 9 Inch Nails, respected them, didn't like Nirvana, and never grasped to Pearl Jam. So, Bill, what's your take on these bands and albums?
I honestly wasn't really a fan of all three myself. 9 Inch Nails, I could take them or leave them. I mean, I get it. There was definitely some thought put into that, and you know, and the Nirvana Unplugged, I mean, it's not bad or anything. I was well over Nirvana by the time that came out.
Right.
And, you know, just wasn't something I wanted to listen to. And unfortunately, if you listen to the radio back then, you could not escape any of it, you know?
Right.
And so I guess I was well burned out by then. And I only liked Pearl Jam's first album, really. So by that time, I definitely wasn't really into Vitology. I'm not a fan of that album.
It was oversaturated.
Absolutely.
I mean, nothing against Pearl Jam. It was just, I mean, and I don't know. I know this was the whole Seattle thing, but I mean, the album cover is just, it's blank. It's leather. It's black. It's bland. We weren't used to that stuff. We were used to colors and all kinds of crazy stuff on there. But let's not forget our guitar hero, the metal god Rob Halford. You know what? He hooked up with Trent Reznor eventually down the line, and he put out that album called the 2 album, right? And you know, even Rob had a period there of industrialization, let's call it. But but again, this is what we were saying in the beginning of the show. We can't take this away from the 4 or 5 bands we just talked about, because every one of these bands was at their biggest point of their career. They were the face of rock and roll. And you know, it's funny, Bill, you mentioned something before and I wanted to comment on it. There was, like I said, the 80s bands are heroes, right? What really came out of 1994 from these 80s bands, it was amazing. You always just think something's there. And then you look at it and you're like, there was nothing there. And I mean, it was a matter of, there was maybe 6 releases of bands that came out. Do you remember any of these albums coming out?
Honestly, I don't. No. I mean, Love Hate, I don't remember that album at all. Dangerous Toys, I think I remember that album coming out, but I couldn't name one song off of it.
How about you, Ian? Any memories of Cinderella Still Climbing?
But I mean, I remember Vicious Circle from LA Guns, and that's probably it. I mean, Love Hate at that point, you know, once you got past, you know, Blackout in the Red Room, I kind of was like, they were gone, you know, but you know, to sidestep that a little bit, especially with this collection of bands that's here, the one album that was a diversion that I do have to point out that is a personal favorite of mine is the self-titled from Motley Crue. All right. And the reason that it is because it's such a diversion from what normal Motley Crue sounded like, with John Corabi on vocals. It was so freaking heavy and dark. And that kind of set a different vibe for the band at that point. And unfortunately, they decided to kowtow to their, I don't even know what interest it was. You know, they pulled Vince Neil back in 96 and they released some terrible, terrible albums. You know, but this album here, you know, I would put this album side by side with Too Fast for Love, and I could literally scrap everything else that came in between, including Dr. Feelgood, which is a great album, because I think that's probably their 2 best albums in the catalog. You know,
what exactly did happen? Why was this only a one and done deal?
Well, they did a EP called Quaternary, which was like almost like taking the concept of the Kiss solo albums, but kind of putting it all together. Like, okay, you write a song the way that you want to write a song, and you write a song the way that you want to write a song. So they took the 4 ideas from these guys and they plopped them in, and it was the one collection of stuff that was kind of like an extra add-on for like the first, I think, 200 or 2,000 purchasers of this CD. And I honest to God think it was an ego trip thing with Nikki Sixx, man. I think that they just were not coming across like they wanted to. And when he went back home and he looked at, you know, the books and everything else, and he's like, you know what? Doc McGee was right. We should get Vince back in the band. But Corabi sings the shit out of this album, and he does it so much better than Vince ever could have even thought of doing. And Corabi plays guitar with Mick, helped him write a bunch of the stuff on this. I mean, Anybody that's never checked it out, give yourself a chance, listen to it. It's really a freaking good, heavy, dark album. It's a good album.
A question for you, Ian. The song Brandon.
Yes.
Where did this come from? Was this is this where that song was contained? Brandon?
No, I think
Tommy Lee
I
song?
think that was on Generation Swine. I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Because that was for his kid that was just born. That was when he was, deep in love, and I say deep metaphorically.
Deep in love with Pam Anderson,
yeah.
right?
Because, Tommy's got 3 legs, and, the rest of us are walking around on 2. So,
well, Bill, when you move to Florida and you open up your painting business down there and you happen to run past Pam Anderson, please give her a coat of fresh paint. Because she needs it really bad. And bring out the plaster.
I actually met her in Florida
spackle.
when I lived there.
Really?
I was at a Motley Crue show. They were playing what was called Livestock, and it was an outdoor festival they did every year. And I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, there she is right next to me, and I'm like, "Whoa!" And then she goes, "Whoa!" And that was the extent of our greetings.
You mean you didn't look at her and go, "Hey, nice tits"?
No.
Nothing.
No, I didn't do that.
That's too bad.
But I will say she was funny. She laughed. She,
Sure. They say she's quite the character. I don't. You never know with Hollywood types. What you're going to get. Some of them are a little. But
yeah, and there might be a bit of that too. But
sure.
Yeah.
So just going back to the music, good story, Bill. Bill, how about Corrosion of Conformity's Deliverance? Right, I know you like that album. I don't have to ask you. I know it. Talk about Deliverance.
Oh, that's a killer album. That when that came out, I was very impressed because just the quality of the recording, the songwriting on that album. It's heavier than shit, but there's still a lot of melody, a lot of harmonies. Just they used to play the hell out of Albatross and Clean My Wounds on the radio, but those are 2 great songs. They still get radio play now and then. But just an absolute awesome album, and they're great live. I saw that tour as well. They played
so loud.
St. Pete. Yes, very loud.
So loud when you see them live.
And correct me if I'm wrong. This was the first album where Pepper Keenan took front and center, correct? And he became the face of COC.
Yes, and actually, I was happy for that. But their previous album, I'm sorry, the name of it escapes me.
Blind.
Is it blind, right?
He did sing one song on that album, and that was actually my favorite song on that album. So I was very happy that he became their full-time frontman.
Yep. Vote with a Bullet. Yep. That was Yep. That was a huge. You could see that's like when the atom bomb got dropped, and you see that, and then you're waiting for the mushroom cloud and the big explosion afterwards. You saw that's Vote with a Bullet.
Yes.
And then Deliverance is and all of the aftermath. I mean, it's just a freaking monster album, man. So good.
Yeah, that one stayed in my deck for a long time.
Yeah.
And that was the sort of they changed their sound or adapted their sound a little bit to have a little bit more of that stoner rock doomy sound. It was less punk, and then they carried it on with Wise Blood and a few of the albums after that. And that's kind of been their sound since, and it's a sound that I personally love. And I can get behind these guys anytime. So one of my favorites from, well, I should say all Tony Martin era Black Sabbath is a favorite of mine. And Sabbath put out Cross Purposes in 1994. Now, this one for me personally meant a lot. Because it was a weird time because, Headless Cross and Tear came out, and then they kind of threw Tony Martin to the street. They brought Dio back for Dehumanizer, and then all of a sudden here comes Tony Martin back in, but Geezer stays along. And what comes out of that is a full album written by Tony and Geezer, not just Tony himself. And great songs. The tour was fucking awesome. Yep. Number one, this was the period where they took out Motorhead for like 3 or 4 straight tours in a row. Nice. But this was also the one where they dusted off all these old Ozzy songs. And they played Symptom of the Universe, Into the Void, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, The Wizard. And it was just a treat to hear this stuff go along with the rest of the catalog, plus the new stuff. Unfortunately, it was that period where the commercial success wasn't that great for the band. They were playing like mid-sized theaters to clubs. I mean, they would always fill up the big cities, but it wasn't the pinnacle of the band, but a period that I much appreciate. Ian, what do you think about Cross Purposes?
I love it. Listen, I went on record before. I mean, the Tony Martin era, the early stuff, the thing that was the craziest part about it was the production. All right. Some of the production to me at times was a little sketch, but I thought that most of the material was really good. Dehumanizer, I thought was holy shit. And then, between Cross Purposes and Forbidden, I mean, these are albums that this is where when you have these bands, unfortunately Bonham died, so you didn't have Sabbath or Zeppelin, for their, their rebirth. But Motorhead, Black Sabbath, consistently, Judas Priest too, sorry. Even with Ripper in there, they did a great job. But those bands continued and really put out some great material. In this time period here, the one thing that I enjoyed about it was actually Geezer and Tony writing together, because Tony had been writing, and the foil on bass that had been opposite of him for the longest time was Neil Murray. And Neil Murray is a monster bass player. But Geezer has a little bit more familiarity with little Riffmeister Tony that he is there. So, I mean, this definitely brought out a lot of great material. Bill, are you a fan at all of this?
Yes, I wasn't at first. I remember the first time I listened to this album, I wasn't fully intent listening to it, and didn't really sink in.
Yep.
And it was a weird time for Sabbath. Honestly, it was a strange time. But man, going back to that album, it's phenomenal. That whole period. I mean, that's Tony Martin's vocals are incredible.
Huge. Yeah. Yep.
And the song Evil Eye, that was the one that Eddie Van Halen did a little tinkering in the studio with Tony. That one's captured, and I don't know remember if it made it to the album or not, but there was definitely at least a thank you on the album from Tony to Eddie. And at least we know at some point they jammed, and that was the song that they tinkered around with. So good stuff
Absolutely.
there. Ian, what else you got from 94? I know there's a couple nuggets you're dying to talk about, and I know one of them. Go ahead, spill it.
So there's this little fella by the name of Zakk Wylde. Got a beard kind of like Bill's. Released an album called Pride and Glory. Now, this was a complete departure from what he had just done previously with Ozzy Osbourne. A little bit more Southern rock, kind of like Blackfoot on steroids, really. But the Pride and Glory album with Brian Tichy on drums and James Lomenzo on bass is such a good album. And it is so heavy and so cool. And it's one of those albums that you could pull out at a backyard barbecue and people would still be digging it, whether they were freaking headbangers or whether they were somebody that was, listening to top 40 radio, because the music is so good as you go through the album. It's just, this was one of those albums, thank God for a couple of these albums that did come out that were saving graces for me, especially for inspiration. This was one of those albums that jumped out of there. All right, obviously the title track, Losing Your Mind, or the starting track, Losing Your Mind, was the big radio friendly. But as you go through and songs like Horse Called War, Shine On, you've got Harvester of Pain, Trouble Wine, Machine Gun, Crimey River, Towing the Line. There are songs on here that literally could have been on any modern day heavy rock, stoner rock, doom rock, whatever you want to call it, kind of album. These guys did something completely different at the time. And those three musicians together was just fantastic. And
they were going for a bit of a Southern rock
huge.
sound. I remember for me at that time, I didn't understand why, maybe I was even a little angry at Zakk. I was like, what? Zakk brings back Ozzy from the dead, 2 or 3 great albums, and then he leaves. Sure. Like, I don't get this. And this is what he wants to do, like Southern rock. I remember seeing him at the Birch Hill nightclub in Jersey when this album came out. And this is sad, but there was maybe 100 people there. And it was empty. Zach was running around, standing on the bar, soloing, drinking beer. But it was like a 2.5-hour show where every song was played. He was doing covers of Allman Brothers, Skinner, Sabbath songs. It was, and then he followed it up a couple of years later with another solo album. I don't remember the name of that one. Was it Book of Shadows? Right? But it was definitely his Allman's period, you know?
If you remember the Confederate flag guitar he had, because he was into the whole Southern vibe, Ozzy set the thing on fucking fire. And after they put it out, Zach kept it the way it was, and all he did was he nailed beer bottle caps to the fucking thing. And that's how it was decorated. And I think it still hangs in his vault today the same way, you know, because Ozzy was like, oh, fuck that Southern shit or whatever the hell he said to him. But out of that Southern thing that Zach was into, you had songs on No More Tears like Mama, I'm Coming Home with the twangy, you know, ghost bends and the banjo rolls and the slide guitars. So I was a fan, you know, and especially digging bands like Molly Hatchet, Skinner, and Blackfoot. Yeah. This was, I was like, okay, go with it, Zach. Let's see what happens. You know, he just kind of put his spin to it. So
I gotta say, I love this album. I loved it from the minute I heard it. I love it to this very day. In fact, I just jammed it the other day from start to finish.
Nice.
And I saw the tour, and I was lucky. I saw it in St. Pete, and there was a lot of people at that show.
Yeah.
It was at Janus Landing, which is still there. It's a outdoor joint. It holds like 1,000 people, and it was pretty packed.
Nice.
And just like you said, naming off all those tunes, they're except for the very last song, I Hate Your Guts. And even it doesn't bother me one bit, the Southern twang or any of that. I love it. I think it's great, man. He just does it so amazingly. And honestly, I think it's the best thing Zach's ever done. That's my personal opinion. I No Rest for the Wicked, No More Tears. Those are great albums, but that Pride and Glory is just amazing.
I thought that when he released the first Black Label Society album, that I was like, I can dig it. I see the vibe he's going for, but I wish he would have gotten Black Label or Pride and Glory back together.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
Those guys there, it's like, okay, listen, here's some heavier ideas I got, but let's see if we can kind of make it sound like what we did. And I thought that would have been awesome. I keep my fingers crossed that one day he may decide to do another one, but I don't know if
his voice is the same as it was back then, but yeah.
No, but when he was singing back then, I liked his voice a lot better.
I loved it. He has a great voice. He really does have a great singing voice. And real quick, he grew up in Jackson, New Jersey, which is a very redneck town. Mm-hmm. So he was always a redneck. He was born in a redneck town. So
sure.
Yeah.
Now
I know Jackson well.
Well, it was. I don't know how it is now. I'm talking about back in the 80s.
It's still that way a bit.
Now, Lance, you got to remember when he was first getting this band together, he did a pop-up show that there's actually a YouTube video of. It was in a strip mall down in Jersey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll have to look that up. I'm not aware of that one. So
yep, they got up, they jammed. I think they did Mississippi Queen and War Pigs and something else.
I've seen that.
Yeah. It was actually pretty cool. He's out there with his sleeveless flannel shirt and his baseball cap. But that was right down in Jersey. Was that like some, I was waiting to see girls with big, the big hair,
So earlier this week, John and I had the pleasure of speaking to Tommy Victor of Prong. Oh, nice. And they have a great new album out called State of Emergency. But in 1994, their signature album, Cleansing, came out. I was a huge fan of Prong. Their sound was different. It was a bit thrashy. It was a bit metal. It had industrial flavor. It had Tommy Victor's signature guitar sound, the vocal delivery. Cleansing will be their claim to fame album. Snap Your Fingers, Snap Your Neck, Cut Rate. Whose Fist This Is This Anyway? I love this period. It was a weird one. It didn't fit in, but it was a good one. Another one that was a weird one and a good one that didn't fit in was King's X. They put out the album Dogman. It was heavy. It was dark. I don't know if this was their way of picking up grunge, but both of these albums were kind of outliers for me, but really were great quality material for the year. Yep. What do you guys think about these albums? Do you like them? Do you dislike them? Do you not know about them?
Go ahead, Bill.
I saw them both on those tours, and I thought they were great. The King's X, I'm not as much of a huge fan of that album, but it is dark. It is heavy. I think they were definitely pissed off at the time. I think that was their statement, is that they were pissed. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I don't like it. It's just that it's not my favorite album, but it's definitely a good album, and they were great live. And same thing. I'm Beg to Differ is my favorite Prong album, but when this album came out, all of a sudden they were huge. And I saw them in it was a decent sized club in Tampa, and it was sold out, and it was a great show. They put on a hell of a show.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing I do have to reiterate was I think that grunge took a lot more nod from King's X than King's X took from the grunge movement. You know, I mean, King's X had some brooding moments since their beginning. This was definitely a darker overall album, but I think there was so many albums at this time period that kind of did that route. Dogman's a great album. Now the Cleansing, from Prong. I remember first time hearing it, I'm thinking, I go, okay, these guys got something going on. You could tell they've got that East Coast attitude versus West Coast vibe. You understand? It's like with Typo Negative. It's kind of like with Bio.
They're a New York band. They are a New York band. It's like with
Biohazard. It's like, when you hear that, I always told everybody, I go, people talk about, Anthrax and Slayer, essentially, all the bands in that period, though, grew up liking hardcore as well as heavy metal. But there's a difference between New York hardcore and West Coast hardcore, and when you listen to Anthrax, you can hear the New York hardcore, where when you listen to Slayer, you don't hear as much of the West Coast, because some of the West Coast stuff was a little bit different. It's there, but it's not like with Anthrax. It's like, oh, I can hear the hardcore.
The West Coast was more loose.
Yeah.
Their hardcore,
especially
was
the Black Flag shit. Yeah. Loose. Think about it. Yeah. Where New York hardcore was, I'll meet you in the alley, motherfucker.
I got to throw this in. Sick of It All. That was a great Scratch the Surface. Great album that came out in 1994.
Yes, it would.
That's what I'm saying about 94. There's variety all over the board, right? You can't really say there was one thing or another. I don't want to lose track of some of our heroes from back in the day, but there was 3 albums that came out this year that probably flew under the radar. I think they're all good, but we don't remember them as these albums that make or break the band's career. Sure. Alice Cooper, Megadeth, Bruce Dickinson, right? Alice Cooper puts out The Last Temptation.
Great album.
Good album. It's a good album, right? But you don't remember it for anything in particular. Right. You had the song Lost in America on there. They didn't do a ton of touring in the States for it. I remember it also was like, okay, they just came off the MTV era with Hey Stupid and, the prior album with Poison on it. But, good album, just flew under the radar.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
I would think the other ones would be Bruce Dickinson, right? Now, were you guys a fan of the Bruce Dickinson album, Balls to Picasso? I personally don't have a big recollection of it, and I don't know why, because I loved his solo albums, Tattooed Millionaire, but I don't know. Maybe I was just not thinking about Bruce at this time. Bill, do you remember this one at all?
Honestly, I don't. I know I've heard it, but I couldn't name one song off it right now because I never did own it, and it just kind of surpassed me.
and that's not to be an insult to Bruce. I mean, Bruce is amazing, but
No, yeah.
I totally, I'm in the same ballpark as Bill. I couldn't tell you, if you played me a song and it's, oh yeah, I remember that song.
I think Tears of the Dragon was maybe the one song that got a little airplay.
Yeah,
but it didn't have that same radio aura as Tattooed Millionaire at all.
Right. And I don't even know, because like at this point, let's just throw it out there for the kids that grew up in the 80s. MTV was in flux, not fucked like it is, later on in the 90s. But at this point, like even a Headbangers Ball thing, I mean, they were minimizing it down to nothing. I think 120 minutes became 360 minutes, whatever the hell they did with it. They had all of these stupid programs that they did, and everything that was anything that we grew up with was kind of getting pushed further away. Yeah. So like you were seeing like scattered bits of stuff that came through.
Yeah, Beavis and Butthead was the biggest thing on MTV at the time.
Yeah. Yep. And that was, thank God, because down the road a couple of years is, my pregnant 16-year-old daughter or whatever the hell it is, their stupid show, no music, nothing but garbage, so I mean, I guess that experiment ended badly. So thank you, MTV, for showing us that videos do suck. Yes.
So Megadeth puts out Euthanasia. I think it's a good album. It's different, but it's got some good tracks on it. Sure. Again, not one you're going to pull out of your top 5, but I think we can all agree there's probably 4 or 5 great tracks on it, right? Yeah.
I mean, it's a good album, but not a great album. It's not a bad album, but it's definitely not one that I reach for when I want to listen to Megadeth.
Right. Correct. Yeah. It kind of lost, I mean, when you got Dave singing, you're going to retain at least a little bit of the Megadeth kind of sound, but like even the production of it is completely different than
it was toned down for sure.
Yeah. Compared to even Countdown, Countdown still was like, it was like an extension of Rest in Peace at that point, where Rest in Peace, still to me is that's an apex moment for these guys. But, this one was not terrible, but honest to God, I think that what ended up happening was Metallica came out, did the Black Album, okay, proved that they could still rock as heavy as anybody else, but they didn't have to follow the same template over and over again. And when everybody saw that they went on a 2-year tour and they made so much freaking money off touring and the sale of that album that everyone decided, I think I want a piece of that. Slayer, Megadeth. We talked about 2 of those 2 albums right there that followed right afterwards. And it's like they changed their format to try to be something that they're not. And it took them a couple of years to finally get back on track and get back to what they were. And I mean, Metallica's experiment, they did the same thing, but it's no slight to anybody. Nobody wants to rewrite the same album over and over again, with the exception of maybe AC/DC or, somebody like that. But that's a different kind of formula. It's a different kind of vibe. When you're doing thrash metal, I mean, sometimes people get burnt out with stuff, and it's like, well, I want to try to write a song like this, or maybe I want to try to sing like this. So you can't have any slight for them, but to have people criticize one band, but then follow that same trajectory afterwards because they see how much success they had, that was a little bit dissatisfying, I think, at that point.
Right. Yeah.
No, you're right. You're right, Ian. And I think we've talked about this in prior episodes. Mm-hmm. It was the same kind of approach a lot of the 80s bands did. They tried to fit in the current era. It sort of worked, but it didn't. Their heart probably wasn't in it. Again, Euthanasia, Reckoning Day, Train of Consequences, A Tout Le Monde, great songs. The rest of the album, you're not going to remember it. Cool album cover, though.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But it's worth a shout out.
Who wouldn't want to hang babies out on a clothesline? I thought about that.
I can't imagine Dave Mustaine in 2023 putting an album cover out like that. He's probably looking at that going, cringe.
Right.
Well, guys, now comes to the point of this episode where we have to get uncomfortable as we're finishing up 1994, but we have to acknowledge it. We talked about not much of the 80s bands was left, no big hitters, very few new releases. The 90s grunge sound, they're at their pinnacle. A lot of the metal bands are hanging on in one way or another, but now there's a new wave of metal coming through called nu metal. And two bands debuted their albums, Korn and Marilyn Manson. And again, whether we like it or not, we have to be objective here and acknowledge their existence in 1994. I'm not going to say what I think of them. I want you guys go first.
I want you to go
I'll
first.
say real quick about Korn. I actually saw them before that album came out, and I was mildly surprised that I had no idea who they were. And they were opening for Sick of It All, actually.
Oh.
And they kicked ass. I mean, they blew the place away. They definitely stole the show. I thought it was cool. I thought what they were doing was totally different. And I liked it for a minute. And I will say a minute because it got old really fast.
Right.
Ian?
The one thing that I always like to tell people about corn is when you eat it, it comes out looking the same way in your shit. And that's the exact same way that I felt. Don't get me wrong. I mean, at this point, you're hearing it on the radio. It's hitting you all the time on MTV. And all right, after a while, you kind of start doing the head nod thing to some of the songs. But then when I listen back to it afterwards, I'm like, I don't know how I could have stood to listen because the subtonic frequencies of the guitars were tuned lower than the bass. So you're hearing that slapping ping of the bass guitar. And then the guitars with that. No, I like staccato picking. Give me Hetfield any day over that, or input said guitarist, that kind of gets that vibe. I just really wasn't a big fan. And then
I didn't dig it either, honestly. And it was, that's an amazing explanation from a musician's point of view, Ian. I would have never known what any of that stuff means. But to me, it was angry, but it was almost like whiny, angry.
Yeah.
And just, I remember the kids that were coming around at that point of time, they just looked like fucking weirdos. I hate to say it, like they were just like sticking out. They didn't have an identity. And I'm just like, what the fuck is this stuff? And Manson comes out the same way. And, for all that, the people that like Manson, it was like, it created a whole new generation of, I wouldn't even call it metalheads. Because now, let's be honest, as we go through the 90s, this stuff is going to be like the new metal is the foundation of the 90s from 95, probably to 2000. Hey. And all the big tours, Ozfest comes out. He's taking all these bands out, and they still got staying power. So, and it picked up a whole new generation of fans. Whether we liked it or not, it was part of the metal community.
This was the beginning of the Hot Topic crowd. Okay. You remember those stovepipe frickin' pants that the kids would wear in the 90s? Okay. All that shit started around this time. It was just, it was different. It was almost like being obnoxious just to make sure that you pissed off people. Where we're all old headbangers. Yeah, we had long hair. Yeah, we smoked cigarettes. Yeah, we got drunk, but you never went home and looked at your mother and said, fuck you, Mom. This is the generation that did. We never would.
Yep.
And that's kind of, and I, to coin a phrase from the Vernomatic, I don't want to be the old man, get off my lawn guy, but that's what, this is what I think of, it's like, okay, I get out of here, and these are the same kids now that have kids that, they're living in the same dumpy old shithole and they're on welfare, and it's the stuff that drives us all crazy, and I just want my metal to be metal. I don't want my metal to be hip hop. I'm sorry. I don't.
You just want your MTV.
Well,
you just want your MTV.
I just want the old vinyl. Give me the vinyl. That's really what it is.
And it's amazing as we're describing how these bands like Manson and Korn are pissed off. As Ian's talking about it, he's getting pissed off.
It's just, and I'm not trying to be a jerk, but it's, you think about where we came from musically. It was fun. Even if it was angry and dark and heavy, it was fun. Nobody wanted it where, like, with these kids, all of a sudden it was like things went sideways real quick.
Well, I would say this. You could go to like Party City during the Halloween season and you could go back and say, hey, I want to be an 80s rocker. And there's going to be wigs and outfits. And you could even go there and get 90s grunge outfits, flannel jackets and other. I'm telling you right now, there's no fucking way there's going to be a this kind of new metal outfit. Sure. Right. Nobody's going to Halloween and dressed up as new metal. No, thank you.
Well, when we were kids, think about it. What you got to remember back in the 80s, early 80s, everybody at one point went as a punk rocker. You had that spray on hairspray stuff. So everybody would spray a stripe in their hair or, try to, make their hair stick up as a mohawk, and you're wearing funky glasses and weird clothes, that was just one of those things.
Absolutely. So kids, get back out there and let's end this on a good note. You're going to take out COC's Deliverance, Overkill's Wide Fucking Open, and you're going to take out Black Sabbath's Cross Purposes. And that's the way you straighten up from Metal 1994. Guys, we covered it all. This was a fantastic episode. Great to have you guys back on. We will do it again soon. 1995's coming. We're going to hear all about that. And we promise you guys back sooner than 6 months from now. Okay? Promise, guys.
Metal for life.
Thank you for listening to Metal Mayhem ROC. Check out our website at metalmayhemroc.com for information on podcasts, archives, links to all our live radio shows, and all sorts of info. Please like, follow, and share with everyone, even your non-metal friends. And always remember to keep it heavy.